I was talking last week about how I personally reacted to this statue at different times in my life. I first met it in 1962 when my mother insisted on living out in the Japanese economy. So we lived in Kamakura, which is where which is an ancient capital of Japan. It's filled with artifacts which were not bombed during World War II. And so I had occasion to experience Daibutsu. This statue is called Daibutsu by the Japanese, which means Great Buddha. And it is, I think it's 23 feet tall. It's a bronze statue, and it has been there since 1295. And originally it had the largest wooden building in the world around it as a temple. But in 1495, 200 years later, there was a huge tsunami that hit this part of Japan, and the size of it still astounds me to think about it, because this statue has to be about 200 feet above sea level. And so it's up from the beach. It's only a couple of miles from the beach in Kamakura, but it's up a hill, fairly steep hill. And so I'd estimate it's about 200 feet above sea level. And the temple that this was housed in was washed away at that time in 1495, and it was never rebuilt. And so this statue has sat in this place ever since, out in the open. So when I first met it, I said, wow, okay, that's a Japanese artifact, and, what's this guy doing? I had no idea who it was or why it was. When I went back in my 30s, because I was there from, about the age 33 to 40, and I visited many times. I took people on tours out there many times when I was living in Tokyo. And at that time, I realized that this was the Buddha meditating. But I had no idea what that might mean at the time. And now, as I look at it, and I've actually been around Buddhism for quite a while, and if you look in my rearview mirror here, there's my wife's picture of the Buddha, which is a Buddha statue in Hawaii, and my wife is a Buddhist lay teacher. She actually did sort of the equivalent of Buddhist divinity school in a home study, so she knows a lot about Buddhism. And so now I recognize that when you meditate, it gives you the opportunity to clear away the dross of your everyday life and actually connect with yourself, as Dr. Jung would have it, the archetype of the self, which is the deepest archetype in the unconscious, and we would call the God image, or Dr. Jung would call the God image, keeping in mind that Dr. Jung also said that human beings cannot differentiate between the God image, the archetypal God image, and the metaphysical God. And so, but we'll keep it on the psychological level. So this is an archetype that appears in all human beings. And in Buddhism, they were meditating to be in connection with this self. And so now I do meditate occasionally, or actually I sort of meditate all the time in one way or another. And I'll show you that a little bit later in this session. But there's another image that I wanted to share with you. that I didn't get to last week, and that is this one. This is Ofuna Kannon, and Ofuna Kannon is the so-called goddess of mercy. And as it happened, this statue was built in memoriam to the Japanese war dead. I didn't know that until the last couple of years, as a matter of fact. But it was constructed in 1961, and then I arrived right after it was built, actually. And it so happened that this is the so-called goddess of mercy, and the goddess of mercy is, this Kannon is the female emanation of what the Tibetan Buddhists would call Avolokiteshvara. And so the compassionate aspect of Buddhism. And but I didn't know all that when I was in high school. And every day coming home, in the mornings I would go to school in a U.S. Navy gray school bus, believe it or not, which would come out to Kamakura and pick us up. But if I wanted to be in extracurricular activities, I had to go home on the train. And as you can appreciate, being an American Navy junior, being in Japan was quite a potpourri of different sights, sounds, smells, ideas, culture, you name it. And it was overwhelming at times. And what I found was that my train would go by Ofuna Kannon every day about 6 p.m. and it would pass within 100 yards of this statue. And then it would continue on to Kamakura. The significance of this is that for reasons that are mysterious to me, I found this statue extremely pleasing and soothing at a time when I was facing a lot of conflict, because there is the usual stuff that goes on in high school, plus there was the need to get back and get home from school every day at age 15 on public transportation in Japan, a country we had been at war with, very seriously at war with, only 17 years before. And it was quite an intense experience for a young man. And so this statue has always, to me, been very soothing. And every time I even look at a picture of it, I feel all those experiences going back now all the way to 1962, so a long time. And I still find it, makes me emotional to look at it and think of it and so on. So, can it lead to a misadventure? Well, sure it can. But anyway, Dr. Jung was talking in paragraph 26 about psychic states inside and outside, and I guess that was the point that I was trying to get to on this, which is that obviously every time I look at this statue, I enter into a psychic state. And unfortunately, in paragraph 26, Dr. Jung discusses or ducks any discussion of the inside and outside psychic states. So that's partially why I'm discussing this now, because that's a psychic state that every time I look at this statue, it calms me down. It makes me feel peaceful, and I don't know why, and it always has ever since the first time I saw it. And but anyway, what Dr. Jung is now starting to talk about in paragraph 26, is that the symbols that appeared symbolically, that appeared in the Chinese in ancient China, and now this is a document that's about 3,000 years old, were the same as he was finding in his medical practice. And last week, let me see if I can show it to you. Here on the left, on the top left, we see an adept in meditation, and he's actually imagining looking down on himself, so taking himself out of the potpourri of life and looking down and examining himself. And it's very similar to Dr. Jung's own image, which this painting on the right side with the circle and the cross in the sun, and Jesus Christ meditating over the city of Geneva, which is what I discovered this morning, that this image actually represents being over the image of Geneva. And so Dr. Jung would have painted this image sometime between 1913 and 1918, which is when he was doing the Red Book. So at that point, he had no knowledge of the golden flower or the image that's on the left, and yet the symbolism is almost identical, and that's the point that I wanted to make for now on this. I'll come back to that later. Isn't Eastern mysticism focused on ego dissolution versus Jung's focus on strengthening and expanding ego, or am I mistaken? Okay, I think that the way Dr. Jung would say it, rather, is that Jesus Christ is on the ego end of the spectrum, and there's a spectrum of an axis or spectrum, which is the ego self axis. And so in Jungian psychology, the ego end would be represented by Jesus Christ, who is a symbol. He's a symbol of the self, according to Dr. Jung, and the God image, but he gets there through ego, because he gets there by self-sacrifice and suffering, whereas the Eastern adept simply goes directly to the self through meditation. And so, yes, Eastern meditation is about dissolving the ego, and from Dr. Jung's point of view, we want to strengthen our ego, but not hubris. We're not talking about hubris now, but from Dr. Jung's point of view, we want to strengthen our ego so that when the two streams of our psyche come through, one is the good side and one is the dark side, one is the light side and one is the dark side, that we will choose to go with the light rather than the dark. So may the force be with you, because those forces are coming through us all the time, as Dr. Jung points out, and we need to have a strong enough ego to deal with that. The Eastern approach would simply to say it's all illusion. But Dr. Jung was a psychiatrist, so he was dealing with the reality of the Western psyche and what was in it. And this is what he was saying. There's two streams coming out, one good and one bad, and we need to if we're going to keep society going, we need to be weighting the scale as much as possible on the good side. So let's see now. Let me go back. Gray says, Jung more so seemed to want to connect the ego to the self-God image, symbolized by Christ, very roughly speaking. Yes, correct. Jungian commitment to the hero journey that hopefully results in ego death. Well, actually, Dr. Jung murdered the hero. Because Siegfried was the hero. And in the Red Book, he had to kill a certain attitude which was within him, and it was within lots of Germans, almost all Germans of the time, presumably, in some way. And he recognized that hero was leading to problems. At the time, he thought it was leading to problems only within his own psyche. But as he started to have these prefiguration visions and dreams about World War I, he recognized that it was a collective issue that was coming up. He didn't realize that until World War I broke out. When World War I broke out, he went, phew, it isn't just me, it's everybody. And so that was really the beginning of his study of the collective unconscious. And so I don't think that Jung would lionize the hero journey as we have done in film, for example. Each one of us has to suffer, and each one of us needs to be pulled apart by the opposites. But that's sort of an individual task. It's not a hero's task for society at large. I don't, if we look at how our society is being pulled apart, we all have to examine ourselves on that, regardless of what our political stance might be. Obviously, we have a huge national neurosis at this point, this red state, blue state neurosis. And we need to look within ourselves and find within ourselves where the issue is. And I don't think that there's going to be a hero per se riding in on a white or a black horse to, or a red or a blue horse to solve the problem and make us all Americans again. I mean, one thing that might do it is if we have a god-awful war. That's what happened in World War II. That, a lot of ego and attitude got beaten out of the American people because we had 8 or 10 years, or 10 years of the Great Depression, so people were really beaten down. And then we had a war where we had to fight for our survival. And so at the end of World War II, there wasn't a lot of attitude, ego floating around. And so this is one of the reasons why people my age and older think of the 50s and 60s, at least the 50s, as being sort of a golden time. Because, Americans, we were all Americans, and we all saw ourselves as Americans. And even when I was in the Marine Corps and on active duty in 68 to 71, it was all Americans. I never had a political thought that whole active duty time, other than I wanted to defeat North Vietnam as a Marine. So I don't know if I quite addressed that, but and Gray says, Skip was a whole answer to Job's section on the channel. Right. I have, not only have I read the whole book into the channel, but I've also done an entire course that's available on the channel on Answer to Job. And so I urge you to take a look at that, but you don't have to read the book. If you like to listen in the car or something like that, you can go actually listen to the playlist. And I've actually read it, and as of now I have permission from Princeton University Press to read it, and my permission is to leave it there for 3 years. So you have 3 years from Princeton University Press's permission to read it. Matthew says, I have had dreams where something is trying to teach me the union of opposites. Part of this union is pulling the higher self into myself so they can exist together. Well, I think that that's very likely. And the fact that you can bring those dreams into your consciousness suggests that you're on your way. And just hang on to your hat, because it's once you start getting into this field of opposites, this is why Dr. Jung felt that what he was talking about was for people in the second half of life, 35 years and beyond, because by that time we've built up a strong enough ego so that we can make moral judgment about what's coming up in the opposites. And from his point of view, people less than 35 years old are still learning how to be human beings, and they're taking care of the basic reproductive aspects of life. And so they haven't really had time to think about these issues. Now, I do know that I have a number of subscribers, quite a number, who are well below 35, that are in the 20 to 35-year range. And so it's important for those listeners to understand the Job archetype. And that is, I'm going to just put it on here for everybody again: contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. Okay. And that is the formula for building a strong ego. The more times you go through that cycle, the stronger your ego will be. And obviously the ones that don't make it through that cycle end up committing suicide too young, because they can't handle what they run into. And so if I think about military guys, when they come home from being in a war zone, they often have like 1,000-yard stare, and Dad never talked about his time in the war type thing, because warriors, military men, very often run into some pretty horrific things in their wartime experience. And you know, a lot of them have trouble coming out of it, and that comes out in the form of PTSD and other things. You know, I don't know how we educate people better on psychology. We probably should. I think we should. I think we'd save a lot of marriages if we did that. But anyway, once you're in the issue of the conflict of opposites, there's no going back. I mean, once you're there, and then you have this wrestling match going on. And you know, we've seen it, we see it now writ large on our national psyche, because we have this arm wrestling match between the red states and the blue states, and the Republicans and the Democrats. And without talking about who's right and who's wrong, that's the kind of battle that can also be going on in your individual psyche, with respect to many different issues. And you need to have a strong enough ego to deal with that. And if you don't, if you're having difficulty with it, then you need to see someone who's a professional, a mental health person, and hopefully you would see a Jungian, because I'm not an advocate for drugging away depression and that sort of thing. I think that that's a very superficial answer that doesn't take you any place, and also I think it's a principal cause for our opioid epidemic, among other things. So we need to learn how to make adjustments in our psyche, in our depth psyche, and that's one of the things that this reading group is about. So Grace says, the hero's journey is within, not without. Yes, that's absolutely true. And for Muslims, the idea of jihad is actually an idea exactly like that. It's an internal battle. It's not an external battle. And most Muslims know that, but some venal, politically oriented men in Islam use illusion to get people to kill themselves in suicide attacks, and those are ignorant people, because when you're dead, you're dead. Okay, and so one of the dictums of mine, which I have adopted from my friend Meltamadikan, is when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. And so, unfortunately, young people who kill themselves so that they can have 72 virgins are unfortunately very ignorant, and sad. Anyway, to coin a phrase. Union of opposites is one of the most beautiful ideas I've ever thought about. So much wholeness. Yeah, I mean, that's the essence of it, and that's really the essence of 20 volumes of Jungian psychology. So if you get that and you don't need any more, then you don't need to spend Monday evenings listening to me. Okay. Cognitive dissonance from ego's difficulty coping with paradoxes. Obviously, we have lots of those. I mean, you can well imagine what it was like for me in Japan 17 years after World War II. I mean, I had seen the movies, all those John Wayne movies, Battle Cry, and read all those books. In fact, I think I read Battle Cry on my way to Japan the first time on January the 23rd, 1962. In those days, we didn't have jets, so there was I guess we had 3 9-hour legs to Japan in an old 4-engined military plane, and I read Battle Cry during that, and then I arrive in Tokyo, or in outside of Tokyo, Tachikawa Air Force Base, some of you may know, and immediately drove 3 hours through Tokyo, Yokohama, and Yokosuka to the hotel we were staying at. And for a 15-year-old, that was a lot to take in, I can tell you. And so, you know, it would be great to have known some of this stuff back then.